All right, let's get started. Good evening to our audiences in China and good day to those of you from around the world. I'm Lin Xin, Managing Director of Caixin Global. We're very pleased to have this session to kick off our Global Thinker series in collaboration with the Berggruen Institute. Our topic today is the global pandemic and crisis management. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to ravage around the world and will likely to coexist with us for a very long time. The challenges are daunting, from humanitarian to economic crisis, and it's not the first pandemic in human history, nor would it be the last one. And if you look at a broader view, it's just one of the many crises that human being needs to face, and in turn will shape our life, our thoughts, our behaviors, and change the trajectory of history, and probably even how we define us as human beings. During the crisis, the urgency is stronger than ever to listen to the wise men or wise women as well. And also you can tell from the sales of some of the books that jump over the ceiling, including Albert Camus' La Peste, and also Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Professor Diamond has published another book recently. I have both of the books with me, and this is the one in China, very timely, called The Upheaval, telling us how human beings are dealing with crisis from the example of several countries. So we're very, very lucky to have Professor Diamond joining us today, sharing with us his thoughts on the pandemic and how well societies would deal with crisis management. Professor Diamond needs little introduction. We all know he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of 5 best-selling books translated into 38 languages, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. He's also a professor of geography at the University of California, Los Angeles, and among the areas he teaches are also biology and digestive physiology, conservation biology, you name it. I pretend I understand what these words mean. So among his honors are including the Pulitzer Prize I just mentioned, and also the US National Medal of Science, and a long list. So without further ado, we'll hear a presentation, a few remarks from Professor Diamond, and then soon we'll also hear comments and a dialogue with Songbing, our good friend, and also Vice President of the Berggruen Institute and the Director of its China Center, to share her thoughts and questions. And then we'll open up for the Q&A, the interaction with the audience. So Professor Diamond, please.
It's a pleasure for me to be with you. I wish I were with you in person. I wish this were a happy occasion. This is not a happy occasion for the world. We're, of course, in the middle of a crisis, a world tragedy. This crisis is nevertheless an opportunity to change our world for the better. And so the crisis may have a happy consequence. But at the beginning, let me acknowledge that this is a tragedy. There's no question that it's a tragedy. Already, nearly 1 million people are dead. Millions are infected. It's a tragedy that I experience as a personal tragedy because within the last 3 weeks, my wife and I have lost 5 of our closest friends who've been dear friends to us for 50 or 60 years. So I acknowledge that this is a tragedy, just as it's a tragedy for many of you and for the whole world. But I'd like to show you that this tragedy is a crisis that may produce something good. Let's think about what the world is going to be like next year, because probably next year or maybe the following year, we'll have vaccines against COVID. We'll have gotten through the immediate crisis. How will the COVID crisis, how will this tragedy have changed us? I'm interested in crises in general. My recent book, Upheaval, is a book that is about national crises, the crises that afflict individual countries. this is a subject that interests me because when I look back on my life over the last 60 years, the countries that I've lived in and that I know the best are countries that either were undergoing a crisis while I was there, or had experienced a crisis, or were about to undergo a crisis. For example, I first visited in Finland, the European country, in 1961, when the Berlin Wall was erected. I was living in Chile a few years before the terrible 1973 coup d'etat, military coup in Chile. I first visited in Finland, the European country of Finland, after its war against the Soviet Union, when the Finns managed to retain their independence, but at great personal loss. I began to work in Australia just as Australia was beginning to deal with the slow-moving crisis of getting rid of Australia's White Australia policy. I've dealt with Japan, I've spent time in Italy, and of course, the United States. We have our own crises. So I'm familiar with national crises. That's what interests me in crises. But my wife, Marie, is a clinical psychologist with a specialty in a branch of psychotherapy called crisis therapy. The usual psychotherapy counseling is long-term. It helps people deal with long-term problems, and a psychotherapist like Marie, a psychologist, will talk with someone for several years to help them deal with problems resulting from their childhood. But all of you, I'm sure every one of you in China and the United States and everywhere in the world, you all know about personal crises, something that happens to you suddenly. Your marriage breaks up, or it's at risk of breaking up. A loved one has died. Your parent, your child, your spouse has died, making you doubt that this is a fair world. You've lost your job. There's been a blow to your health. All of us undergo personal crises. And Marie and other psychotherapists help people deal with personal crises. Each week, Marie and her fellow therapists would talk about the patients in their office and who was dealing well with their personal crisis and who was dealing not so well. And as Marie talked to me about the outcome predictors for personal crises, about the factors that make it more or less likely that a person will deal with a marital crisis or a job crisis, I realized similar outcome predictors apply to national crises. Let me give you examples. These examples, all of you will know from your personal lives of the things that have affected your own or your friends' personal crises, but similar factors apply to national crises. You all know that in a personal crisis, the first thing you have to do is to acknowledge that you're facing a crisis. If you deny that there's a crisis, if you refuse to believe that your marriage is breaking up because there's something wrong, of course, you're going to make no progress towards resolving the crisis. And similarly, nations have to acknowledge a crisis. We see that today with COVID. There are countries that are acknowledging the problem, and there are countries that are refusing to acknowledge the problem of COVID. Within my own country, the United States, my own state of California, its governor fully acknowledged the problem of COVID. There are other states like Mississippi and Texas and Florida where the governor has refused to acknowledge the problem of COVID. And of course, that means it will not be solved. Again, you all know from your personal experience that to resolve a personal crisis, you have to accept responsibility for doing something. You can't just blame others. And similarly, countries, to resolve a national crisis, they have to acknowledge that they have responsibility to do something. They can't just blame others. An example is Germany after World War I and World War II. Germany after World War I blamed its defeat in World War I on backstabbing by people in Germany, by enemies of Germany, instead of accepting the responsibility of the German government. And that resulted in the disaster of Nazism for Germany. But after World War II, the Germans fully acknowledged what they had done to provoke the disaster of World War II. And so Germany, by acknowledging, has recovered much better from World War II than World War I. You all know from your personal experience that if you have a crisis, if your husband or wife says, I want a divorce, you know you have to make some changes, but the changes have to be selective. You're not going to change everything about yourself just because your marriage broke down. Some things about yourself need changing and some don't. The essence is then selective change. And similarly, countries, when a country faces a crisis, the country has to figure out what in the country is working well and what has to be changed. Japan, for example, in 1853, when Japan was confronted by the West, Japan made changes but preserved some things. Japan still uses the kanji writing system. Japan still has its emperor, but Japan adopted a Western-style government. And similarly, China, in the last 75 years, China has made massive changes, but other things in China have not changed. You still have your wonderful Chinese writing. That did not change. Another example you know from experience, in a personal crisis, you may seek help from friends who face similar problems. You may use friends as models for how they solved a similar problem. If your marriage is breaking up, you may ask a friend whose marriage was also threatened how they resolved their marital problem. And similarly, nations may use other nations as models for solving a problem, or they may refuse to use other nations as models. You know from personal experience that honesty is essential in resolving a personal crisis. If you're dishonest with yourself, you won't resolve the crisis. But nations also have to be honest in resolving a national crisis. So those then are examples of the factors that I'm sure are familiar to every one of you in China and that are familiar to every one of us in the United States and Europe about the outcomes of personal crises. But I realized that similar factors also apply to outcomes of national crises, and they apply to outcomes of business crises, and they apply to outcomes of the world crisis that is facing the world today. With that as background, that's the framework about crises that serves as the framework for my recent book, Upheaval. Let's now see how this framework applies to our current world crisis, and in particular, how does it apply to COVID? COVID, of course, is causing a crisis for the world. But countries have crises, the world has had crises. What is there unique about COVID? Well, what's unique about COVID is that this is the first time in world history that the world has an acknowledged global problem. Before in history, there have been local problems, there have been Asian problems, there have been European problems, there have been problems for China, problems for the United States. But until now, there has never been a problem that has affected the whole world and that everybody in the world acknowledged was a big global problem. For the first time, COVID is an acknowledged global problem that every country in the world acknowledges because every country either is already infected or is at risk of being infected. But it's also clear that COVID is a global problem that requires a global solution. COVID cannot be solved one country at a time. Suppose China, for example, succeeded in eliminating COVID in all of China. Does that mean that China is safe forever? Of course not, because there are jet planes connecting China with so many other countries. China will not be safe until the whole world is safe. And similarly, my country, the United States, cannot make itself safe by eliminating COVID in the United States. The United States will not be safe until the whole world is safe. So for the first time in world history, we have a global problem that requires a global solution. COVID is also a dramatic global problem. Of course, there are other global problems that I'll talk about in a moment. There's the problem of climate change, which is a global problem. There's the problem of resource exhaustion, which is a global problem. But COVID is a much more recognizable global problem. COVID kills you in 2 or 3 days. Climate change does not kill you in 2 or 3 days. If you die of COVID, there's no doubt that you died of COVID. If you die of a consequence of climate change, such as air pollution or low food production or rising sea level, it's not clear, it's not so clear that that was because of climate change. So COVID is recognizable as a global problem. It's a global problem, and it's a recognizable global problem that has to be solved globally. One might say, yes, COVID is a tragedy, but realistically, it's not the biggest problem that the world faces. The worst that could happen, COVID has already killed 1 million people. Maybe in the very worst case, everybody in the world gets infected and 2% of them die. So the very worst that could happen with COVID would be maybe 150 million people dying. That's terrible. But there are bigger global problems than 150 million people dying. Think of the really big global problems. There's climate change that affects everybody in the world. All 7.5 billion people in the world are or will be affected by climate change. There's the nuclear danger, the risk of the use of nuclear weapons. Even if nuclear weapons were used just by 2 countries, the result would be the pollution of our atmosphere and everybody in the world being affected by the use of nuclear weapons. There's the risk, the global problem of resource depletion. Every country, China, the United States, Europe, South America, every country is no longer self-sufficient, but all countries depend upon resources imported from the rest of the world. China imports seafood, the United States imports seafood, timber, soil. The world has these problems of resource use, of the exhaustion of forests and fisheries and topsoil, and even the exhaustion of water. In China, you have big problems with water. In the United States, we have big problems with water. These are global problems. Until now, however, the countries of the world have not regarded climate change as a global problem. But just think, there's no way that China alone can solve the problem of climate change in China. Climate change is ultimately due to fossil fuels and carbon dioxide. It's impossible for China to fix the carbon dioxide levels over China because the atmosphere of China is connected to the atmosphere of the rest of the world. Similarly, it's impossible for the United States to solve the problem of climate change just for the United States. Climate change, then, like COVID, is an example of a global problem that requires global solutions. It requires collaboration between China and the United States and Europe and Australia and Japan and Africa. The problem of unsustainable resource use requires global cooperation. And the problem of inequality, the problems resulting from the fact that there are rich countries and that there are poor countries, but that we're all in the same world. And poor countries affect rich countries. There again is a global problem requiring global solutions. But even though these global problems, such as climate change, are more serious than the tragedy of COVID, the world has not united against climate change. Why? Because climate change doesn't kill people quickly enough, as does COVID. Climate change doesn't kill unequivocally, as does COVID. What then may happen next year? I mentioned at the beginning that COVID is a tragedy, but is a tragedy that I think may have a happy outcome. COVID, it's clear that the world has to unite in combating COVID. And probably in a year or two, through vaccines, through the sharing of vaccines around the world, we will have succeeded in mastering COVID. For the first time in world history, then, countries of the world will have worked together to solve a global problem. And my hope is then that COVID will serve as an example to the world to unite in solving other global problems, to unite in solving the problem of climate change and resource depletion and inequality. So in short, the tragedy of COVID may have a happy consequence, the consequence of motivating the world to undertake global responses to global problems. If that is the case, then this tragedy, which I'm sure many of you feel as a personal tragedy, and which certainly I and my wife already have felt as a personal tragedy. If that happens, then the tragedy of COVID may cause our world to change for the better. And so I end this talk about a tragedy on an optimistic note.
Thank you. It's a very comprehensive overview of what you said in the book, and your thoughts ranging from the personal crisis to the national crisis and the global crisis we're in. Song Bing, I'll turn this to you.
Sure.
Share with us your comments and questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Diamond. When I was listening to you, it was sort of a replay of the book that I just finished reading, Upheaval. So it's both therapeutic and instructive for both personal and then national and global crisis. It's wonderful. I feel it's a great honor, okay, for me to be sharing my comments, not just on behalf of myself, dare I say, perhaps millions of readers in China. I think it must be gratifying for you as an author that your books are both timely and timeless. Xin just pointed out earlier that your book of Guns, Germs, and Steel, actually together with Albert Camus' The Plague, became bestsellers again in China in the past pandemic months. So I would say if you can write a book or books which are timely and timeless, this is probably the highest accolade an author can have. Really, we're so, we feel so privileged to having this conversation with you. So before we move on to the global pandemic and then the handling of the crisis by nation states, I actually want to talk a little bit about the approach and then the angles of your books. In particular, I'll share with you and then the broader audience, perhaps in sort of, with three comments / kind of questions, okay? The first actually relates to the approach that you used in Upheaval. You actually explained in detail, in your talk. So basically that's my view, okay? The approach of using personal therapies for thinking about the crisis of nation states is refreshing and perhaps is unprecedented in the Western scholarship of history and international politics. Now I'm eager to share with you is that the approach of drawing parallels between self-reflection and self-improvement on the one hand, and community soul-search and collective well-being on the other is a tradition in the East, which can go back thousands of years. It is reflected in Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. So according to these traditions, personal moral character building is intricately bound up with the order of community. And similarly, the ills of society reflect the moral decay of individuals. So individuals' life lessons are instructive for society and community building. Effectively, the individual life paths and collective path are mutually embedded. They're influencing each other. So in times of a crisis, according to those traditions, the first order of things is self-reflection and self-review. What did I do wrong? Rather than pointing fingers at others. Close to the end of your book, Upheaval, when you discuss the looming threats of democracy in the United States, I remember you noted that, let me just quote this in your language, there is no way that China or Mexico can destroy the US. Only Americans can destroy ourselves, end of quote. So my first question, or rather a cluster of questions to you is that, given drawing the lessons from individual lives for the general society, it's relatively unusual in the Western scholarship. How have your Western colleagues and critics been reacting to this methodology? Do you think the US is going through a process of self-reflection, or, using your word, an honest self-appraisal in your 12-factor analysis framework? If so, what are those areas of a self-reflection that is happening in the United States right now? This would be my first question. Over to you, Professor Diamond.
Shall I talk about your first question now?
Yes, please.
It's a very interesting question that you raise, and that's very current to us Americans. I'm sure you've heard in China, and we in the United States are in the middle of it. The United States is torn in different directions. I can't give you, I would be dishonest if I gave you a simple answer and said that the United States is doing self-reflection. I would be dishonest if I said the United States is not doing self-reflection. Different Americans are doing different things, particularly with the American political system, because we have a central government, but we have our 50 states. And our 50 states are powerful. The central government is not all powerful. Some of the states are behaving much more responsibly than is our central federal government. And some of the states are behaving better than other states. In my own state of California, our Governor Newsom ordered the first lockdown in the United States. Other states of the United States, such as Mississippi and Texas and Florida, have denied the reality of COVID. The leader of our federal government has, to a considerable extent, denied the reality of COVID. So the answer to your question about how is this in the United States, in some respects it's bad, and in other respects it's good, and we shall see what happens to the United States within the next year. We are torn in different directions.
Great, thank you. Okay, so maybe I just continue with my other questions, okay? Maybe we can come back to some of the comments you just made in the later discussions. So my second sort of cluster of comments and questions relates to the role of cultures and values in understanding different fates of human societies and, for that matter, the different handling of large crises. In your Upheaval, you discuss how 7 nation states handled their national crises. Personally, I'm most interested in 2 cases. One is Finland, and the other is Japan. I learned so much from your book. In your book, we were told that Finland was a small liberal democracy stacking up against the menacing mammoth and totalitarian Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. So the odds were really bad, okay, no good, to say the least. I think there's no exaggeration to say that Finland was really stuck between a rock and a hard place. But Finland survived and thrived. So, it maintained its territorial integrity, and then at the same time, it maintained trusting relationship with the former Soviet Union, and then also kept up its close relationships with the Western countries. I think, in one part that you are talking about their preventive diplomacy, and then also you're talking about the ability of understanding or thinking from other people's perspectives. So that's why I feel the Finland case is highly, highly inspiring. And I would say their policies are probably one of the most creative, disciplined, and thoughtful foreign policies I've ever sort of come across. And then, so again, I sort of see quite a bit of a parallels between the Eastern thinking, and then what Finland has gone through in a way. The second case relates to Japan. That's a fascinating case as well. It's not just to me personally. I suspect that many Chinese readers will be really interested in reading your Japan's case, how Japan transitioned from an ancient, feudal, and closed society to a powerful modern state. I would say 3 questions, at least, on my mind when I was reading your Japan case. The first is, how did Japan manage its transition to modernity without suffering the fate of European domination and national division as China did? And then secondly, so how was Japan able to produce modern mosaic identity, using your word? In other words, westernizing its political, social, and educational institutions, but at the same time, retaining its strong, unique cultural identity that, as you pointed out earlier, the writing system and its belief system in Shintoism, and also loyalty in the Japanese emperor, right? So all those things remained. Third is, how did Japan skid into militarism and territorial conquests at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century? I would say your book answered the first 2 questions, but did not fully address the third, okay, in my humble opinion. I think to address the third, one needs to delve into value shifts and value transformation a lot more in Japan at the time. You did not quite elaborate from this angle in your Upheaval book. Similarly, I would say in the Guns and Germs and Steel book, when you discussed why European colonized Americas and parts of Asia, but not the other way around, you didn't discuss much about the role of Christian monotheism and the mercantilism in this dramatic shift of faiths, for many societies. So my queries here, or cluster of questions here, are: to what extent we need to examine values and cultures for understanding different faiths of societies? What role have cultures and values played in shaping the histories? Similarly, in the current crisis that we are in, do cultures and values play a role in shaping different responses of the countries? Over to you, Professor Diamond.
You have raised 73 important questions and issues. And so I can respond only to a couple of them. You are correct that in my book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, there were some questions that I did not fully address, to which I would say, be grateful that I did not fully address them, because if I had, my book of 500 pages would have been a book of 3,732 pages. Why did Japan relapse into militarism in the 1920s and 1930s? Multiple reasons. One reason, I think, is that in the 1800s, Japan sent its ambassadors, sent scholars to learn from the West and from Europe. Japan came to understand the West very well. In the 1920s and 1930s, Japan sent many fewer Japanese to the West, and those that were sent went particularly to Nazi Germany. And so Japan was not nearly as familiar with the West in the 1930s as it was in the 1800s, which I think contributed to the disastrous decisions that Japan made then. That's one point. Another point that I would mention among your 73 points is the role of culture. Yes, the role of culture is very important. Different countries have different cultures. The culture of China is different from the culture of the United States. It's difficult for Americans to understand China. It's difficult for Chinese people and Europeans to understand the United States. And I will take just one example of that. My European friends, and my guess is that in China, it's impossible for Europeans to understand the American fondness for guns, the private guns, firearms. Why is it that in the United States, anybody can have a gun, and so many Americans have guns, and so many Americans commit crimes with guns. In Europe, that's forbidden. To have a gun in Europe, you need to study for a year, and you have to have reasons, you have to pass exam. Why this cultural role of guns in the United States, but not in China or in Europe? Think of the history of the United States. The United States was settled by Europeans starting on the East Coast, and Europeans gradually spread west, so that the United States always had a frontier from the beginning, from 1620, until the frontier was closed in around 1890. Every part of the United States was originally a frontier where there were wild animals and where the government was far away. On the frontier, people needed guns. The United States has that history, and that history has remained with us today, a history of a use of guns that is dangerous to us and that my European friends justifiably consider as crazy. Finally, a point about the United States that I would mention, a cultural difference is that, as you mentioned, there is more cultural connection, much more sense of community in Asia than there is certainly in the United States. Why? A possible reason is that population density is lower in the United States. We have nearly 350 million people spread into a very large area. China has 5 times as many people in a comparable area. Americans are spread out more. Americans are more individual. We're less dependent on other Americans. And I think that contributes to the lower sense of community in the United States than in China. I could talk for another 73 hours about your other 76 questions, but let me stop now and give you an opportunity to say more.
Thank you so much. Yes, I completely agree with you on those points. Anyway, so, okay, maybe I quickly move on to my third question, because there are other people in the audience who would like to ask questions as well. So my third cluster of comments and questions relates to your intellectual path. Your path of intellectual pursuit has been most unusual, and it's highly, highly inspiring. I don't even use the word career path, okay? Because the word of career path simply sounds too instrumental and flat or even boring. So for you, it's really the path of an intellectual pursuit. You bringing deep research insights from a vast sort of area of academic disciplines. Xin named a few, like physiology, ecology, biology. I don't pretend I understand all those things either, okay? So, and geography, and of course, you know, popular science writing as well. I don't know what are the hidden talents that you still manage to maintain, okay? So, you know, I remember I said it was one occasion, I wrote in my book reviews of your books, it's like, you seems like as if you led multiple lives in one lifespan. I don't know how you managed to do it. So anyway, I do hope the audience, the parents of young children in the audience really need to listen up, okay, to this question. My question here is really, what motivated you to expand into some areas of a study? And then what were the turning points when you changing, you know, amongst the different, you know, academic disciplines and stuff? And then that's one question. And related, okay, this is more not about you, it's more broader question is, how do you evaluate today's education system focusing on specialization? And then what impact have your books had on the mainstream academic research? Thank you.
3 good questions. What motivates me? My parents had a big role in it. My mother was a linguist. She loved languages. Her university specialty was languages, but my mother is also a pianist, very good concert pianist. And so early, I came to love languages. I've now learned 13 languages, unfortunately not including Chinese, but I love languages. I love playing the piano. My father was a scientist, a physician. He got me interested in science. When I was 7 years old, I became interested in bird watching. But also, remember, I was born in 1937. That means that I grew up during the Second World War. In the United States, growing up in Boston, I was not bombed. My parents were not killed. But nevertheless, growing up during the war in the United States meant that every night my father on the wall of my bedroom pinned up two maps. There was a map of Europe and the battle lines in Europe. There was a map of Asia and the battle lines in the Pacific. And so I grew up with maps and history literally in my face. That meant that when I came to college, I was interested in languages, but I was interested in music, but I was interested in medicine, but I was interested in history. I was fortunate that I've been able to pursue three careers. First, my career in laboratory science, physiology. Then my career in studying birds, particularly on the island of New Guinea. And now my career in history and geography. Finally, you asked about a turning point in my life. For me, perhaps the biggest single turning point in my life was the birth of my twin sons, Marie and I, my wife and I. Our sons, we have twins, were born just short of my 50th birthday. And until then, I was a specialist in the physiology of the gallbladder, a small organ inside of us. When my sons were born, I realized the future of my sons is not going to depend upon the gallbladder. The future of my sons is going to depend upon the world, on history and geography. And so it was the birth of my sons that motivated me to start writing books for the public. First, my book, The Third Chimpanzee. Then in 1997, my book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Then my book, Why is Sex Fun? About evolution of human sexuality. Then Collapse. Then The World Until Yesterday. And now my book, Upheaval. So for me, the turning point was the birth of my sons.
Great, thank you so much. I think a lot of great tips for parents, actually, of young children. First and foremost, be a good role model yourself. Thank you so much. What about the impact on the sort of the academic research and then writing? I know for a fact that Yuval Harari was highly, highly inspired by you. That's why he started writing about the short history of Homo sapien and many other books.
Every day, literally every day, I receive emails from around the world. Today, I received emails from someone, I believe, in Pakistan, another email from someone in Egypt, some emails from people in Australia and the United States, who said that they read Guns, Germs, Steel or Upheaval, and it changed their view of the world. That's, for me, very satisfying as an author. To write for the general public, if you are an academic like myself, if you hold a job in a university, I don't know how it is in China, but certainly in the United States, if you are an academic, a professor, and you write for the broad public, other professors are likely to be jealous, and they're likely to think he's writing for the public because he no longer has original research ideas, and so he lowers himself by writing for the public. And so the reaction that I get from my fellow academics is a mixed reaction, also because in academia, one is expected to be a specialist. But here I am writing about gallbladders and also about China and also about playing the piano. There are many academics who don't like that. I would be unhappy and nervous if it were not for the fact that every day I receive these emails from people all over the world saying that they were influenced by my books. Yuval Harari is an example. When I met Yuval, he told me that he had been a student at Oxford doing his thesis on some obscure fact of medieval history when he read Guns, Germs, and Steel, and he realized that he could write bigger things.
There you go. I think you're going to get millions of such letters from China, except in Chinese. So I think you should continue writing about what you've been writing about. It's been wonderful. It's very, It's just absolutely inspiring for so many of us. Okay, so maybe back to you, Xin.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Song Ping, and thanks for Professor Diamond for this fascinating dialogue, ranging from the global crisis to your personal stories, and I just certainly want to hear more. But let's pick some questions from the audience. And the first question, actually, I'll follow Song Ping, combine several of the questions. How would you view the different approaches of the US, Europe, and China on dealing with the pandemic, the COVID crisis? And what would be the cultural roots behind those approaches?
Very good question. The different approaches of the US, Europe, and China. The first thing to say is that as regards the US and Europe, it's not that there's one approach in Europe. It's not that there's one approach in the US. There are 51 approaches in the US, 50 approaches of our different states, and an approach of our federal government. There are many different approaches. Some states deny, some states recognize. Similarly, in Europe, there are different approaches. Sweden adopted the approach of letting everybody do anything in the hope of building up herd immunity. It seems that that approach is not working well. In Britain, again, Britain's Prime Minister, Johnson, adopted an approach of denial. In contrast, in Germany, Angela Merkel, a wonderful prime minister, adopted a good policy towards COVID, just as she's adopted a good policy towards everything else. And an extreme example in Europe is Finland. Finland, because of their experience with the Soviet Union, the Finns, having been cut off from trade with the outside world, the Finns realized they have to be prepared for everything. And so in Finland, there's a committee that meets every month. Each month they consider a different possible disaster, and they discuss how to prepare for the disaster. Among other things, Finland stockpiles everything. And so, of course, Finland stockpiles face masks, but Finland also stockpiles fuel for cars, and Finland stockpiles wheat, and Finland stockpiles medicines, and Finland stockpiles chemicals. Finland, because of its experience, is prepared for everything. And therefore, in answer to your question, how do I compare the responses of China, the United States, and Europe? My guess is that China is more unified than either the United States or Europe. And in the United States, we have 51 approaches. And in Europe, with 48 countries, we have 48 approaches.
Yep.
May I add to a point about China?
Yeah.
I think there was one thing is, you read in the Western media, when they comment on the China responses, they mostly focus on state capacity, state compulsion, which is true to a large extent. I don't actually dispute that. And then now we're talking about the cultural sort of responses more at the grassroots level. I mean, at that point of view, I mean, when we talk about this, I do think that there is a cultural aspect which is not very much discussed in the Western media. Okay, reports on China's response. It is, I call it the family state nexus. So in other words, because I think you cannot underestimate the level of cooperation of ordinary people in China in terms of the responses to the coronavirus. So people literally get locked in or locked down in their communities, and then they can't go out to go to restaurants with their friends, and then even hang out, right? Just taking a walk in the park. So the level of cooperation was absolutely astonishing. I don't think it can be accomplished merely just by state compulsion and then state capacity. It is the culture where people, where that's how people evaluate or prioritize, let's say, the values of collective well-being over individual liberties. I think this is the culture still very much alive in today's China. I think this is the point obviously, I think it can be explained in the relative success in other East Asian countries as well. So, China is not an exception to that.
That's very interesting. I would just like to make one comment about that, because it's a contrast between China and the United States. In the United States, where we are gradually relaxing lockdowns, large numbers of Americans are behaving selfishly. You may have seen the pictures of people going out to the beaches, and they're not maintaining social distance. They're going out on the beaches without face masks. They're very close to each other. On the night before last, on our street here in Los Angeles, my wife and I walked up the street, and we saw that there was a party in a house up the street, a party with 80 people coming to the party with no face masks, very close to each other. My guess is that 2 weeks from now, 79 people in that party are going to be sick and will have infected other people. So that's an example of the lower connection to the community in the United States because of our history than there is in China.
Thanks for the exchange of views, and continue talking about the global crisis, but from a different angle. Just now we talk about different societies handle that differently and the cultural roots. And but collectively, also as Professor Diamond has mentioned, COVID is probably the first recognizable and recognized global crisis. And it might have positive consequences, but it will take some elements for the positive consequence to come out. So what does it take to actually prompt the collective actions for the global community to address this global crisis? And if they really take those actions, what selective changes the world should adopt? For you, Professor Diamond. And then Songbin, feel free to add.
Another great question. The public consequences, the possible public consequences of COVID, I gave you an optimistic picture that COVID might mobilize the world to take world action. A pessimistic picture, which people discuss, is that instead countries will behave selfishly. Perhaps a few countries will develop vaccines, perhaps the United States, perhaps Europe, perhaps China will develop vaccines, and perhaps each of those countries will be selfish about it. Perhaps if the United States develops a vaccine, we will not share it with the rest of the world. I don't know what China will do. I don't know what Europe will do. Unfortunately, COVID is a convincing teacher. COVID will teach those who develop vaccines that if they don't share the vaccines, they are just going to get reinfected. And so suppose, for example, that Britain developed a vaccine and kept the vaccine to itself and didn't share it with Europe. British people will then get reinfected by European people. They'll get reinfected by Americans. They'll get reinfected from Asia. My hope then is that COVID will force people to recognize the public consequences, but it's uncertain because people can behave selfishly and people can behave stupidly, and there are many cases in world history where people have behaved stupidly. So 1.5 years from now, ask me your question again, and I will tell you the answer.
I would say one consoling or comforting fact is that I think scientists in the US and China are working closely with each other. So the scientists and then the medical profession seem to be working with each other. So this is really, really encouraging, notwithstanding the geopolitical tension, okay, at the national and global level. So that's something that obviously we would like to see more coming, hopefully institutionalized. So in other words, the role of a multilateral organizations will continue to have a big role to play. And another point I would like to add is you actually pointed out that different governments were racing, right, to develop the vaccine and then the effective treatment. So I think China did publicly announce that if China developed the vaccine first, it will make it into a global public commodity, right? Something along those lines. I don't know the details of a mechanism of implementing that, making it like a global public good that's available to everyone. But certainly that statement has been made. So we'll be curious to see how the development will be in the coming months.
And I will take your word that we'll come back and do this again next year and to review whether they check all the boxes and are doing better. Next question is actually slightly on a less visible crisis, how tech is changing our human life. Professor Diamond wrote in your books that the absence of face-to-face communication is one of the reasons for the more polarization of the society, which is very true. And I like the fact that when you talk with many of the tech gurus, including Bill Gates, you emphasize the point that tech is actually changing our life and not necessarily for the better. So in light of that, and for the less visible crisis, will be how the tech is changing our human life, our human being, the ability of communicating, the ability of deep thinking. Do you worry about any of those crises along the line?
I worry about them a lot. And I worry about them because of experiences that I've had that most Americans and Chinese and European people do not have. For the last 55 years, I've been working on the island of New Guinea. New Guinea is that big tropical island north of Australia. New Guinea is very traditional. Until recently, New Guineans were using stone tools. They did not have writing. They did not have central government. New Guinea is a traditional society. In New Guinea, communication has always been face-to-face. You look at someone who's 2 feet from you, and you hear them, and you look at them with your eyes, and you feel their body language. That's face-to-face communication. In the United States, and increasingly in Europe and Japan and other countries, communication has become non-face-to-face. We communicate with people not looking them in the eye, but we communicate with them by our cell phones and by our computers. That brings advantages. Advantages are that with my computer, I can collaborate with Chinese colleagues. I now have 2 collaborations with Chinese colleagues, one to study the origins of agriculture, another a close Chinese friend of mine with whom I've studied environmental problems. But the downside is that with non-face-to-face communication, you don't have a live person. You have words on a screen. And it's easy to be insulting and scornful to words on a screen. That's much easier than it is to insult a person in front of you. So I see the development of indirect communication as an underlying cause of the development of polarization and of rudeness around the world.
Reality and augmented reality technologies can help address part of the issues. I agree with you. Face-to-face communication is the best. It's the best way for establishing personal trust with each other, even though you may have a drastically different points of view. But I do have faith in in high technology who can help address some of the problems.
Great. So last question is a more future-oriented one. The question is on how to get people recognize problems for other looming global risks. You identify a few, and you also emphasize that it's important for anyone individually or as a nation or collectively to recognize the problem first. So how to get people recognized for the future crisis sooner?
How does one get people to recognize future crises sooner? Authors like myself have to learn to be selfish and to promote their own books. And so I would say that one way to get people to recognize the crises is for them to read my books about crises. That's one way. Another less selfish way is that leaders can play a big role. Different countries have different leaders. Some leaders really take the lead. Some leaders refuse to take the lead. You can all think of countries, countries neither China nor the United States. There are some large countries whose leaders are not taking an effective action against COVID, in fact, are denying it. That's bad leadership. There are countries whose leaders are adopting good leadership. And so when you say as a final question, how do you get people to recognize problems? There's an expression, bottoms up and top down. People can recognize problems by themselves and push their leaders to recognize the problem, but also a leader can play a role. Within my lifetime, there have been great leaders who played an important role in world history. Winston Churchill, in the history of Britain, is a good example. And Angela Merkel now in Germany is another good example. So leaders can play a role both for the good and for the bad. We need more leaders who will play a role for the good. In the United States, this coming July 4 is our biggest national holiday in the United States. It's Independence Day, when we Americans reflect on our history. Independence Day, July 4, would be an opportunity for the leader of the United States to talk about the things that hold all Americans together. I'm afraid that our current leader may not do that, but we have had leaders such as Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, who did play a role as leaders. In short, your question, what can get people to recognize problems? A good leader.
A good leader. Thank you. That's a very powerful answer. And as we approach the end of our session today, I want to finish with a lot of practical tips so that we can have multiple lives in one lifespan, quoting Songbing, and what I see as a dream experience of any journalist who would imagine that be at the forefront of any news as they evolve. So I will ask you a few questions for how do you keep the energy and keep being so productive and still do the deep thinking. So I read from your books that you said just now that you learned 13 languages. What's the latest language you learned and when did you start learning it?
The last language that I learned was Italian. I began to learn Italian when I was 62 years old. I read Italian now every day. It's my second best foreign language. My best foreign language is German because I lived in Germany, but Italian I read every day. An hour ago before our talk, I was reading by Dante, the greatest Italian, the Divina Commedia of Dante. So Italian was my last foreign language, but it is so much work at age 62 to learn a foreign language that 13 languages is enough, and I'm not going to learn another language.
I actually believe you will start another one probably in a year or two. And you also wrote in your book that you actually work out very regularly and do weightlifting. So how often do you do that?
I do push-ups every day in the morning. My gymnasium at my school is closed down because of lockdown. But when my gym was opened, I would work out 3 times a week. Yeah, I do lots of exercises. It helps. My wife, Marie, is younger than I am, and Marie is in very good condition. Marie and I, when we were getting to know each other, when we were dating, we used to wrestle until we wrestled, and I ended up in the emergency room because I was the stronger one. And my twin sons, are 33 years old, and they also work out. In the evening nowadays, Marie and I often take a walk in the evening, a walk of 3 kilometers. So it helps me to work out that I have a young wife and young children.
And also, for the audience who might not know your age, if I'm not mistaken, you are 83 this year?
I will be 83 in June, July, in 3 months. I'm 82 82 3/4.
And continue doing the push-up and all the exercise. That's great. These are all the energy behind the books and your great thoughts. And the last question is, we all know that you wrote a lot about the deep thinking and the role technology plays in human life, but also you are not necessarily so savvy about the modern tech handset herself. So do you remember what's the latest model? What's the model of your iPhone that you're using? Or
behold, my iPhone, and I have to add that I bought this iPhone 4 years ago. My wife and one of my sons forced me to buy it. I do not know how to take pictures with it yet. I do not know how to make recordings with it yet, but I can use it to write emails and to read emails, and that's all that I can do with it.
So great. And also I'm glad we hold this discussion on Zoom seamlessly without any problem. But thank you for sharing your wonderful tips and for sharing wonderful insights, of course. And as we approach the end of our discussion today, I will thank you for your time and insights. I'll thank the audience for your attention. So read Professor Diamond's book, Upheaval. I'll mention this again. It's published in Chinese in April this year. And you can also read Song Bing's book review about this wonderful book at caixinglobal.com. And you can watch our discussion today live. Thank you for your attention. And also a replay at Caixin and Douyin. So thank you all for your time. And I'll hopefully see you soon in our next Great Thinker series.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Diamond. Thank you, Xin.